Pete Holloway. I'm a retired financial advisor and a retired certified financial planner. And as always, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to On Money. This is one of the shows that we do annually, and it's one that I probably look forward to more than anything. My guest is John Deskins. His title, I love this title, is the Assistant Dean of Outreach and Engagement at WVU and Director of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research and is Associate Professor at WVU. That's a lot of nice words. He is essentially the chief economist for the state of West Virginia. When the legislature, the governor, or economic development groups need information, John is the first call that they make. He did his undergraduate work in economics at Emory and Henry and got a PhD from the University of Tennessee. He was at 2005, he began as an assistant professor at Creighton, and in 2013 joined WVU. Got one boy, one girl, ages 14 and 16. John, I want to thank you for this, and I'm going to turn everything over to you and let you run this presentation. You did this probably just a week ago for the legislature. Usually this is right at the top of the agenda for the legislature when it first meets. That's how important and valuable it is. Go with it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Pete, thanks for having me. I mean, this is probably the 10th or the 11th time that I've come on to do this show over the years, and I always really enjoy doing it and happy to be here. And you're right, it was about 2 weeks ago. It was on the first day of the legislative session. It's kind of become tradition for me to go to the legislature and kind of kick off the first day of the new legislative session by just talking about what's happening in the state's economy. So that's what I'll do today. And I just will say, I think this is still correct. I have a presentation today that just deals with the state of West Virginia. Then I have another presentation. I'll come back later if I understand correctly. And the other presentation is also touches on the Wheeling area. But today is just the state.
Exactly.
All right, I'll share my screen so you can see some visuals here. I'll just give you kind of a big picture overview before I really get into the detail. The first thing to be aware of is, we still face uncertainty nationally, and that national uncertainty continues to have the potential to trigger a recession in the nation and in West Virginia. Now, this uncertainty and this potential for a recession is a lot lower than it was 6 months ago, or especially a year and a half ago, but there's still a potential there, and we're still not completely out of the woods to say that the national and the state economy are all on solid footing. If you go back a few months, a lot of economists were saying it's a toss-up. There's a 50-50 chance that we're going to face a recession in the near future. But again, it's not gone, but the situation has improved a lot. But because of the headwinds that we face nationally and this continuing uncertainty, we expect growth in West Virginia, but we think the growth is going to be fairly limited. We don't think we're going to see the kind of strong growth that we hope for because of these national challenges. We certainly have challenges here in West Virginia as well for economic development. And I'll talk about some of those today. But I really have a glass half full, glass half empty talk, because while I'm going to be talking about challenges, we still have opportunities as well. And I'll talk about a few things that get me excited about the West Virginia economy. And one other point that I'll really emphasize as we go through this is to say that the successes that we have in our state are far too concentrated geographically. We have good things happening, but they tend to be in just a small number of counties, and many of their counties are just kind of moving sideways, experiencing some stagnation. So all that said, because of the national uncertainty, because of the national situation, I'll just take a couple minutes to talk about what's happening in the nation. I know that's not what the audience wants to hear. They want to hear about West Virginia, but what happens in the nation has important implications for our state. So it does make sense to at least touch on the nation for a second. The real big issue that I want to address is no surprise, it's inflation. Here you see the inflation statistics going back for several years. As everybody knows, inflation reached a very high level in 2022. In the summer of 2022, inflation was the highest that it had been in 40 years. I'm not showing that far back in this figure, but you'd have to go back to the early 1980s to see another inflation figure that was as high as what we saw in the summer of 2022. Now, the statistics have come down a lot. The situation has improved a lot over the last year and a half. But if you really want to look at this closely, the rate of inflation that the Fed targets when the Federal Reserve thinks about inflation and how to address inflation in the country, the rate that they target is represented by the yellow line here. It's the personal consumption expenditures deflator, and they specifically look at the measure that excludes food and energy. But the yellow line is the specific rate that policymakers target. They want that inflation rate to be 2% annually, but the rate is still 3% today. It's still 3%. 3% is a lot better than it was, but it's still, 1.5 times what the Fed wants it to be. So that's the source of the problem, and that's why we're still not out of the woods. As a matter of fact, the forecast that I'm showing it here, this is from S&P Global, an international economics consulting firm, and they don't think that inflation is going to reach the Fed's target until the middle part of 2024, maybe even the third quarter of 2024. So we still have a ways to go before we can say we've gotten through the woods here. If you just want to understand the inflation issue that we face, the story is this inflation came from 4 different factors. When inflation was first sparking up, energy prices were rising rapidly. Energy prices are certainly an important contributor to inflation overall. Furthermore, coming out of COVID, everyone knows we had significant supply chain constraints all across the world. When particular goods are short supplied, basic supply demand economics 101, the price of those goods rises. Also, coming out of COVID, we had some pretty severe labor force shortages. When businesses can't find the workers that they need, they have to pay more. They have to increase wages to attract more people to those jobs. As wages are rising, that's typically passed along to the consumer in the form of higher prices. It's 3 factors. And also coming out of COVID, demand was very strong as well because in part due to very aggressive stimulus measures coming from the US government and the Federal Reserve. So we have 3 supply side factors that are all contributing to inflation. We have very strong demand as well at the time that was contributing to inflation. Put the 4 factors together and the result is the highest inflation that we've seen in 40 years. But here's the catch. Even though these catalysts have disappeared or improved at least to a large extent, the problem is inflation can become self-perpetuating if it's allowed to continue. Even if those original sources all disappear over time, once inflation gets high, it can just feed on itself. It can perpetuate itself if we're not careful. So we can't let that happen. If we've learned anything through economic history, we've learned that inflation can devastate investment and long-term economic growth in an economy. So we have to choke this inflation out of the economy. It's very important for the Fed to do what it is doing, working to try to get inflation down to that 2% target and to make sure that it's stable and expected at that point. Anyway, the way the Fed works to combat inflation is by raising interest rates. Everyone knows that over the last almost 2 years now, interest rates have been rising. As a matter of fact, the degree to which the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates over the last 2 years has pretty much been as aggressive as ever. They've never really raised interest rates more aggressively than what they've been doing over the last almost 2 years. This will push overall demand in the economy down, and it will get rid of that inflation. That's what we're hoping for. But we run a risk. See, the economy isn't a finely tuned machine. The economy is big, complicated. There's uncertainty in the economy. What we're trying to do is to raise interest rates just enough to push demand down just enough to get rid of this inflation, to get back to that stable 2% rate. But we don't want to push the economy down too hard and drive us into a recession. The Fed has a really fine line to walk between raising rates too aggressively and pushing the economy into a recession versus not raising rates aggressively enough and allowing this inflation to continue and create havoc in the economy for years to come. So the Fed really has to walk this fine line. The last time this happened, which was in the early 80s, the result was a severe recession. The very last time we did this, even close to this with this level of aggressiveness, the result was a severe recession. That's the fear. That's the fear that has really been plaguing this economy for the last year and a half. But so far, so good. We've made it now through this process, a year and a half, almost 2 years. Things are still looking good. It seems like the Federal Reserve is working well to strike that appropriate balance to bring down inflation and still keep the economy on track. But again, we're not out of the woods yet. And another part of this puzzle is when interest rates rise, they don't impact the economy until at least a few months down the road. If the Fed raises interest rates today, it's believed that that's not really going to impact the economy until 9 months into the future, not a year or a year and a half. So even though things are going good so far, we haven't seen the full impact of these interest rate increases. And we think, as a matter of fact, that they are going to be an important headwind on the economy going forward over the next few years. As a matter of fact, here is the forecast for total employment in the U.S. over the coming few years. As it stands right now, we're optimistic. We think we're going to get through this by striking that appropriate balance that I described, but we think the long-term lingering impact of these higher interest rates is going to be slow growth. That's good because it's not recession, but it's still slow growth. Overall, in the forecast that you see represented in this figure, we only expect 2 million jobs to be added over the forecast period, and that only represents about 1.5% cumulative growth over the period. Here's the forecast for GDP, representing the total market value of everything that we produce in our economy. Same story. We now think that a recession is not going to happen. We think the economy is going to continue to grow, but we think growth is going to be slower than normal. The yellow line shows, obviously, the 30-year average growth rate in GDP. And if you look at the forecast, it's almost exclusively below the 30-year average. So my point is, uncertainty has diminished. We're optimistic. We don't expect a recession, but the lingering effects of these interest rate increases will cause slow growth over the coming few years. That's the important thing to keep in mind now as we transition into understanding the West Virginia economy. So here's the headline number for our state. The blue line shows total number of private sector jobs in West Virginia, and I have the U.S. employment figure there for comparison. The bad news is we still haven't quite gotten back to where we were before COVID. If you look at the number of jobs in West Virginia in January of 2020, right before COVID hit, we're still about 2,400 jobs shy of that January 2020 level. That represents about 0.4%. So we've almost recovered. We're almost back to where we were, but not quite. And as you see, the growth, as soon as the COVID lockdowns ended, as soon as the economy started to recover, the early growth was very, very rapid. The 2020 to 2021 growth was very rapid, but over the last year and a half, growth has been much more, it's been growth, but it's been much slower. And I will make the point as well that I'm showing private sector employment here specifically. If you look at total employment, the situation's a little bit worse, and that implies that government employment has been even slower to come back than private sector employment. This is the same data, but I'm just converting the data to an index so you can make a really clean comparison between the US and the nation. You can see that over the first year and a half of recovery from COVID, the US and West Virginia were performing very similarly. But since around the middle part of 2021, the US has outpaced West Virginia. As you see, as I just said a second ago, West Virginia now is at 99.6% of the number of jobs that we had in January of 2020. The US, on the other hand, has fully recovered and actually has grown another 3.7%. There you see the 103.7 in the figure. So for whatever reason, we haven't done quite as well as the nation over the last couple of years. Unemployment, on the other hand, is very strong. You see how unemployment has kind of been on a roller coaster ride over the course of COVID there, going from about 5% up to nearly 16% in West Virginia. But after COVID ended, Unemployment recovered very quickly. And actually, since some point in 2022, for about a year and a half or 2 years now, West Virginia has been at historically low unemployment rates. Very, very strong labor market in West Virginia over the last year and a half or so, and in the nation as well. The figure has risen a little bit in the last few months, but we still remain at historic lows. That said, you have to keep in mind that to be considered unemployed, someone has to be actively looking for work. If you lose your job, but if you then decide to retire early, or to be a stay-at-home parent, or to go back to school for more education, when you quit looking for work and you go in that other direction, you're no longer counted as unemployed. You're counted as simply out of the labor force entirely. So most of what you see here in the unemployment rate is legitimate. That is, it's reflective of people who were unemployed who have now found jobs. Most of it is that. But some of the improvement is due to that labor force attrition. So the labor market is strong. It's truly strong. I believe it's strong, but it's not quite as strong as it seems because of that labor force attrition. Now, this takes me to my other point. This is something that you've heard me talk about before. This is something that I really emphasize a lot because this is an important issue for West Virginia. This captures the share of the adult population that wants to work. For this statistic, for labor force participation, it doesn't matter whether the person is actually working or just simply looking for work. It just captures the share of the adult population that wants to work in the first place. National statistic you see there, you see how all the states stack up. West Virginia comes in dead last among the 50 states at 55%. So the problem in our state isn't that people are looking for work and can't find work. That's not the problem. That's what the unemployment rate captures, and that statistic looks good. The problem instead is that we don't have people looking for work in the first place. Labor force participation altogether is low. And there's no way that we can achieve the prosperity that we hope for unless we can get more of our people in the workforce. Has to be an economic development priority to improve that labor force participation rate. Some people come back and say, I've actually heard a lot of this lately. Some people come back and say, oh, well, labor force participation is low because we're an older state. Have a lot of people over age 65. And that's true. That does matter. That is one reason why we have a low rate of labor force participation. But even if you just restrict this to prime working age, if you just look at labor force participation among people who are 25 to 55, we're still 50th in the country. So you can't just attribute this to an older population. It's much deeper than that. Moving on real quick, I mentioned the issue of job openings before. This statistic captures among every 100 jobs that employers want to have, how many of those jobs are currently unfilled. There you see the statistic. The statistic rose a lot over the course of COVID. We got to a high of 8 or 9%. We got to a high of almost 9%, where 9 out of every 100 jobs that employers wanted to have were unfilled. The statistic has improved for the state and for the nation, but this job openings problem is still quite a bit more severe in West Virginia than it is in the nation altogether. I'll just go through a few of the other big statistics here. Per capita personal income, the statistic doesn't look great for West Virginia. We're actually 49th among the 50 states in terms of per capita personal income. We're quite a bit ahead of Mississippi, which is 50th place, and we're just a little bit behind Alabama, which is in 48th place, but that's where we stand. And just to show you how salaries vary in West Virginia across different industrial sectors. As you see, the overall state average salary is somewhere around $50,000 or $55,000 a year. But you can see how much the income data vary as you go from people who are working in utilities and people who are working in mining and gas. There's people making well over $100,000 a year doing very well. You can look at the bottom end of the spectrum, people in leisure and hospitality making just over $20,000 a year. Tremendous variation there across different industries. Here's an uplifting statistic, perhaps. I've had a few bad statistics in there, but this is a biggie. So GDP, as I mentioned before, it measures the total market value of all the stuff that we produce in our economy. The blue bars show GDP for the state, yellow bars for the nation. If you look back, if you go to 2022 and look back, you have to go all the way back to 2011 to find a year where West Virginia outperformed the nation. We went year after year after year where the nation was doing better than West Virginia in terms of increasing output. But our preliminary expectation is that West Virginia is going to actually outperform the nation pretty significantly for 2023. If you look at the expected rate of growth in West Virginia versus the expected rate of growth in the nation, big difference. West Virginia is doing much better for 2023. Now, the data aren't final yet. They aren't going to be final until around the end of March. But as it stands right now, we think the output number is going to look really good for our state. But one caveat to that, here I'm showing you GDP data, but I've indexed the data to just begin in 2017 and show how we've moved since 2017. Yellow line represents output in the mining super sector. Mining, the way it's termed by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, mining includes coal, gas, and a few other extractive areas like rock quarries, for example. Anyway, mining and gas, coal and gas. The blue line is GDP from all the other parts of the West Virginia economy except for coal and gas. As you see, it's quite a stark difference. Coal and gas has been doing very well the last couple of years in terms of increasing output, or at least increasing the value of the output. It's not necessarily tonnage, but it may be price as well. Whereas the rest of the economy collectively has been flat. This points to the need for more diversification. And in West Virginia, we want coal and gas to do good. They help our economy. They're important in many ways, but we have to work to get strength in other parts of the economy. We can't just rely on coal and gas. We want to maintain coal and gas. We want that to be healthy. It's important, but we have to get growth going in other sectors as well. Speaking of coal and gas, this figure shows you our expectation for coal and gas going forward. Natural gas output has been increasing at a healthy rate, almost without pause, going back to around 2011, talking about over a decade now of this natural gas output growth. Coal output, it suffered a lot during COVID. It's improved since COVID, but it hasn't quite gotten back to its pre-COVID level of output for coal. But we actually expect coal output to be relatively stable over the next few years. You have to remember here that a lot of the coal that we produce in West Virginia now is metallurgical coal. It's used in steel production, and a lot of it is coal that's used for export overseas. So thermal coal that's used for electric power generation, that's a much smaller part of the picture in West Virginia. So the stability is really coming from met coal and export coal. So now, before I present the full forecast here really quickly, I do want to just mention this issue of how diverse their economic outcomes are across West Virginia. For this figure, I just looked at the top 10 growth counties from the middle of 2012 to the middle of 2022. There were a few more growth counties than what I've highlighted here, but I just looked at the top 10. Those top 10 growth counties for this period added 14,420 jobs over the years. The rest of the state lost over 58,000 jobs over that period. Now, this is a huge disparity in regional economic outcomes. Here, for example, this is the other one, just the top 10 growth counties. This is a little bit of a different cut. This shows you all the counties that had grown some. This is expressed in percentage terms. So for some of the small counties, the number of jobs added may be small, even though it is positive. There's a number of growth counties going back over the last decade. As you can see, there's way too much red and not nearly enough blue. The blue counties are great. We want them to continue to grow. We want to continue to foster growth in those counties, but we have to get growth to spread out to more and more parts of our state. This is the forecast for employment growth going forward. We think we are moving in the right direction. We think growth is broadening geographically. In the picture looking forward, we have more blue, more white, which is just neutral, and we don't have as much red, but we still need to get that trend to continue quite a bit more to have much more broader based growth geographically. Last one for our forecast. Here's the forecast that we have for you. The blue line represents the expected rate of employment growth for our state going forward. We expect growth to still be pretty strong for 2024. We think this year is going to look okay in terms of growth. That's good. But we do think that the lingering effects of these interest rate increases are actually going to mean the state's going to be pretty flat in the later years of the forecast period. This isn't anything necessarily related to West Virginia. This is because of these headwinds that are created by these high interest rates, by these interest rate increases. Same point is true for the nation, right? It's the nation is expected to see slow growth over the next few years, along with the state. However, I will say the forecast has improved lately as we've seen more and more optimism among analysts, among business people, whoever. So the forecast may continue to improve, but right now we expect continued growth for right now, followed by a relative period of flatness as these interest rate increases work themselves out and as interest rates ultimately begin to fall and get back to normal, hopefully over the next couple of years. Here's a forecast on a sector-by-sector basis in West Virginia. If you Google WVU Bureau of Business and Economic Research and go to the full West Virginia Economic Outlook report there, you can see a lot more detail on a sector-by-sector basis, but I'm, of course, not going to have time to cover all that detail right now. And here's the forecast for the unemployment rate. We actually expect the unemployment rate to rise over the course of 24 and 25. We expect the rate to get back to about 5%, which was the rate that we, used to kind of expect on a normal economy. But the thing to keep in mind here is that we actually expect increases in the unemployment rate to result from people coming into the labor force. Like I mentioned during COVID, people left the labor force to be stay-at-home parents or to be back in school or to retire early. But we think a lot of those people are going to continue to come back into the labor force, and that will actually cause the measured unemployment rate to rise, even though that's a good thing. So the expected increases in the unemployment rate aren't bad. That's actually going to be a good thing for the economy over the next couple of years. So that's it. I think I probably have gone about as long as I should. But that's my take on where we stand broadly in West Virginia right now.
Great. I'm going to ask Teresa to put Teresa's the director, a link to the report you were just mentioning. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you a question. West Virginia has unfortunately been a laggard for quite a while. From time to time, we get these big announcements, Nucor, Form Energy up in Weirton and so forth. Do we get extra leverage because West Virginia has been in such a dire place that when these big plants open up, does that actually add more to the state's economy?
Well, I mean, certainly if you add 1,000 jobs, that makes a bigger splash in a state the size of West Virginia versus a state like California, where 1,000 jobs just doesn't mean very much at all. Mm-hmm. So certainly, but I think it still boils down to convincing these businesses that West Virginia is a good place to be. We have a good site for you. We have site availability that works for your needs. We have the right kind of regulatory and government public policy climate, and that we can provide your business with the workers that it needs to be successful. If you come to West Virginia, you can find a good spot, a good site. You can find the right kind of workers. You can find a good policy environment. That's what we have to really rely on to attract businesses to our state. And as I'll discuss in the next episode, some of those are challenges.
That's great. Well, I want to thank you. I'm going to remind the audience that this is a two-part program. The first one that we just went through is about the state of West Virginia, and the next one will be about the Wheeling region specifically. Again, thank you very much, John, and I want to thank the audience. We'll see you all next week.